There's something about our ability as humans to dynamically regulate our perception in time that is extremely valuable, right? And it's especially salient when we think, okay, there's the cake, I want that. Okay, I'm not going to do that. You have to get out of. You can do things in space, and not outer space, but in physical space, as these kids did with the marshmallow. You can turn around, you can put something in front of it, you could imagine a cockroach on it, but the powerful tools seem to be when we incorporate some exit from the moment into a future moment. Or we could think back. I mean, David Goggins will tell you, and I have a friend who's come on the podcast before, and Samar Hattar is a scientist, and he talked about how he was very, very overweight, and he's doing great now with his health. But David will tell you too, like the fear of being that again is also a motivator. So thoughts to the past, linking the present to that and to a future concept. What we're talking about is mental time travel. And this is a pretty high level thing that I'm assuming my dog, when I put a piece of meat in front of him on the floor, can't do unless I give him a command and I take it away if he doesn't obey the command, which is how he learned it so fast. So when we're talking about dynamic time perception, we know that that's harder when we're under conditions of stress. When we're more relaxed, it's easier to do. So does any of the work that you've looked at in self-control actively incorporate the notion of self-regulation, how calm or how anxious one is? Because we hear this like, oh, some people don't eat when they get anxious, but a lot of people just become anxious eaters. Or, for people in 12-step for alcohol, it's like never be like, what is it, like angry, tired, et cetera, for these very reasons.
I think what you're saying is fundamental to understanding self-control. Self-control fails when we are not able to move in distance, right? So I talked about how self-control is distance dependent. When it's far away, it's easy. When it's close, it's really difficult. And so many of the most effective strategies in self-control require either physically distancing yourself, as you've already talked about, or psychologically distancing myself, finding ways to either to activate the mindsets that I have when the thing is distant. So I'm thinking about it as if it was distance, even though it's proximal, or finding other ways to frame it as if it's distant. So as I said, in my lab, we talk about, again, when things are far away, we tend to think about things in terms of why, but when they're close, we tend to think about them in terms of how. And so in my lab, we sort of stress knowing your whys as one way to extricate yourself psychologically from the situation that you're currently in. Now, you mentioned things like, being drunk or being angry or being tired as things that predispose us to self-control failure. I don't know if it's necessarily that it's difficult, or if it's just they bias us in one direction or the other. And, strong emotional states, we know with alcohol, it creates myopia. We know that when we're tired, we tend to think more myopically, more here and now, because we just want to rest. We don't want to think about the long term. That our mind there's a tractor state towards being very concrete and thinking about how, and which again brings us actually proximal to the temptation. So I'm not sure that it's necessarily harder to do in the sense that it's that much more effort when all else is being equal. It's just that the situation has put us in a situation where it's a lot easier to think proximally than think distally. So what are some other ways in which you can get more distance from a temptation that's not necessarily thinking about why versus how? Other ways might include, and these come from my colleague Ethan Cross, who I know has been a guest on your show, referring to yourself in the third person as opposed to me, right? So I might say, what does Ken want to do in this situation versus what do I want to do? And just simply referring to myself as other people, not me, but as other people would create psychological distance in the space that gives me just enough to think of it as far as opposed to close. I mentioned also a study that, what would Jesus do, for example? He did this with kids, Angela Duckworth and Rachel Carlson at the University of Minnesota. They brought kids in, and in one condition, they just had them do a task that required self-control as they normally would. But in the experimental condition, for the boys, they gave them they gave the children various costumes. They could pick the costume that they wanted to wear the most. It's like a little boy might put on a Batman cape and cowl. And then they were simply asked, as you do this task, we want you to ask the question, what would that character do? So a boy might say, what would Batman do? And they showed that thinking like Batman made them have better self-control. Now, there's many reasons for this, but the reason that they emphasized was that Batman isn't the kid. And so they created distance by emulating somebody else. Research has suggested that the simulation of someone else's mind, in order to simulate someone else's mind, we actually activate the neural circuitry necessary to have that mind. So if I ask myself, what would Batman do? I literally have to think like Batman. I reactivate the kinds of thinking that I think Batman would have. In other words, literally turning me and my cognitive system into somebody else. So, when you are tired and drunk and mad and everything else, one way, if you can't think about your whys and you're having trouble finding distance from the object in front of you, it's not about not being emotional. It's really just finding some psychological space. And one way to do that potentially is to take on someone else's perspective, someone that you really admire.